Once, in a forgotten corner of the world, there stood a dilapidated house, its walls cracked and windows shattered. This abandoned building was home to a terrifying creature, a green monster whose blood was not red, but corrosive acid that burned through anything it touched. No one knew exactly how long the creature had been there, but it was believed to have once been human before it was twisted by the miasma that surrounded the house. The weather in that area was always foul, storm clouds hovered above, never letting the sun through. The wind howled, and the air was thick with a strange, acrid scent. It was said that the monster could smell fear from miles away, and those who wandered too close to its home found themselves driven mad by the terrible stench of decaying flesh and the eerie quiet that enveloped the area. The monster's presence was marked by the faint hiss of its green acid, which it would use to destroy anything it deemed a threat. Its movements were slow, deliberate, but filled with rage. The creature lived alone in its broken home, isolated, yet always watching, always waiting for an intruder. Every few nights, it would leave the house, its grotesque, warped form emerging from the shadows, dripping with the same corrosive liquid that had turned it into a nightmare. Anyone unfortunate enough to step foot inside the miasma-filled house would never leave. The acid seeped into the floors, the walls, and even the air, slowly rotting away any hope of escape. The monster didn't kill quickly, it played with its victims, toying with them before delivering the final blow. The acid was like a slow death, burning through skin, muscle, and bone until nothing remained but a pile of ash and bones, but no one who had ventured too close ever came back to tell the tale. Only whispers and rumors lingered, and the terror of the green monster continued to haunt the nearby villages. Some say it still lurks, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to wander into its reach. The local villagers spoke of the house in hushed tones, passing the tale down through generations. They knew better than to venture anywhere near the cursed place, but it still haunted their dreams. It had been years since anyone had dared to approach the miasma house, but that did not stop the rumors from circulating, like thick smoke in the wind. One stormy evening, a young traveler named David arrived in the village. He had heard the whispers of the green monster and the abandoned house, intrigued by the stories. He had spent his life seeking the unknown, always chasing the thrill of what others feared. To him, the idea of facing such a monster was not only fascinating but an opportunity for fame. The villagers, fearful of the fate that had befallen others, warned him to stay away from the miasma house. But David, undeterred, laughed off their warnings. Monsters don't exist, he scoffed, believing the tale to be nothing more than an old legend meant to scare children. By nightfall, with the storm raging outside, David set out on his own towards the cursed house. The path to their house was overgrown with twisted vines, and the trees around it seemed to bend unnaturally toward the ground, as though trying to shield themselves from the corruption. The air felt thick, and a strange unease settled in David's chest as he drew closer to their house. When he finally arrived, the sight of it took his breath away. The house looked even worse than the villagers had described. Their once grand structure was now a decaying shell, with shattered windows and a roof that appeared as though it could collapse at any moment. The place exuded an oppressive atmosphere, its broken walls seeming to groan under the weight of something unnatural. The wind howled louder as David stepped closer, but it wasn't just the wind that seemed to carry an unsettling hiss. There was something else in the air, something acidic, something that made his skin prickle. He shook off the feeling and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking with a noise that echoed into the darkness inside. As he stepped into the shadowy interior, a strange smell hit him, a mixture of rot, decay, and something else, something metallic. The air was thick, almost choking. The room seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though the walls themselves were warping. In the dim light, he could see streaks of green on the walls, signs of the acid that had eroded the very fabric of the house. It was clear that whatever had lived here had long since lost its humanity. He took another step, and that's when he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. The hiss of liquid moving across the floor. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room, but there was nothing visible. Just shadows. But something was there, lurking just beyond his sight. Suddenly, a sharp noise came from upstairs, a creaking, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving across the floor. David's breath hitched, but his curiosity got the better of him. He crept up the stairs, each step groaning under his weight. The house seemed to pulse with life, or perhaps something darker. At the top of the stairs, he found a narrow hallway. The walls were covered in strange, acidic stains, and the floor was slick with something that made his boots squelch as he moved. The air here was even thicker, and his skin began to burn slightly, as if the very atmosphere was eating at him. He felt his heart race with every step. Then, from behind one of the doors, a low, guttural growl echoed. David froze. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark room. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the far corner, barely visible in the shadows, was the green monster, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Its body was monstrous, covered in patches of rotting skin and thick, glistening acid. Its claws scraped the floor as it moved toward him, and the air seemed to crackle with the toxic energy it exuded. David took a step back, his mouth going dry as the monster's glowing eyes bore into him. It hissed, the sound almost like a snake ready to strike. The acidic liquid dripped from its form, sizzling as it touched the floor. There was no escape now. The monster was awake. And David had just become its next prey. David stood frozen, his eyes locked onto the green monster that was now stalking toward him. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his heart raced as the creature's acidic scent filled the room. The monster's eyes, glowing with an eerie light, seemed to pierce through him, as if it could see every fear, every doubt in his soul. It moved slowly but with purpose, its hulking frame casting dark, monstrous shadows across the room. In the silence, the faint hiss of the acid dripping from its body echoed, like an ominous countdown. Each drop that hit the floor sizzled violently, sending tiny plumes of smoke into the air. David could feel the heat, the subtle burn of the air against his skin, and he instinctively stepped back, only to find himself pressed against the rotting wall. There was nowhere to run. His mind raced. He had to think of something, anything to survive this nightmare. But the fear gripped him, clouding his thoughts, making his legs feel like lead. The monster took another slow step forward, its jagged claws scraping the wooden floor with a sound that sent chills down his spine. With each step, the air seemed to grow thicker, and the burn on his skin intensified. The creature's twisted face contorted in what could only be described as a smile, a cruel, sadistic grin that revealed sharp, broken teeth. It was toying with him, David realized, savoring the moment. The beast wasn't in a rush. It was enjoying his terror. "Please," David whispered, his voice barely audible over the creature's sickening growl. "What do you want from me?" The monster didn't answer. Instead, it raised one of its claws, a grotesque, long nail dripping with the acidic liquid. David could see the fluid glisten in the dim light before the creature swiped it across the air. A low, hissing sound followed, and the acid splashed against the wall beside him, eating through the wood in seconds. David's stomach churned at the sight, the realization of what would happen if the acid touched him sending a fresh wave of panic through his veins. He had to move, he had to find a way to escape. But where? The house was a maze, and the monster was everywhere. The creature was as much a part of the house as the walls themselves. With trembling hands, David grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor, hoping it would somehow defend him. The weapon was useless, but it gave him a fleeting sense of control. He raised it in front of him as the monster took another step, its glowing eyes narrowing in amusement. David's mind screamed for a plan, any plan. His eyes darted to the door behind him, but he knew it was too far. The beast was closing in, and he could hear its breath now, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the room, filling his chest with dread. The acid was eating away at his courage as much as it had eaten away at the house. Suddenly, without warning, the monster lunged. Its claws swiped at him, and David barely managed to dodge, the movement sharp and desperate. He stumbled backward, his body crashing into an old, rotting table. The table splintered under his weight, but the monster didn't stop. It was relentless, its acidic breath now hot on his heels. David scrambled to his feet, but as he did, he slipped on the slick floor. The acid that had leaked from the creature's body had made the ground treacherous, and he slid helplessly toward the open door at the end of the hallway. He had no time to think, no time to plan. The beast was almost upon him. With a cry of pure terror, David pushed himself up, his legs buckling as he made a last-ditch effort to run. But it was too late. The monster's claws grabbed him by the shoulder, lifting him off the ground with terrifying strength. Its claws dug into his skin, and the acidic burn spread through him, sharper than anything he had ever felt. It was a pain that consumed him, a fire that ate through his flesh, and he screamed, loudly, desperately. The monster dragged him back toward the center of the room, and David could feel his strength draining with every passing second. He tried to struggle, to free himself, but the acid from the creature's claws had already begun to melt the skin from his bones. His vision blurred, his body trembling, and all he could think of was the slow, agonizing death that awaited him. In that moment, David realized the horrible truth: there was no escape. The green monster was not just a creature. It was an embodiment of this house's nightmare, an ancient terror that thrived on suffering and despair. The very miasma that surrounded them was feeding it, making it stronger. As the monster's claws tightened, David's vision faded to black. The last thing he saw was the creature's monstrous grin, as if savoring the moment of victory. And then, everything went silent. The storm outside raged, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding within the miasma house. The wind howled, and the rain beat against the cracked windows, but inside, all was silent, save for the occasional hiss of the green monster's acid, still dripping onto the floor like a slow, suffocating death. David was no more. His body, now little more than a mangled mass of flesh and bone, lay forgotten on the floor, slowly consumed by the corrosive liquid that seeped from the creature's claws. Their house, as always, remained in a state of decay, but there was something different this time. The air felt even thicker than before, as though the creature had fed on David's fear, growing stronger, more invincible. Yet there was one remaining soul in the village who had heard of David's disappearance, the last person who would dare to investigate the house, Eleanor. She had grown up hearing the tales of the green monster, stories that had been passed down through generations. Unlike the villagers, who had long abandoned any hope of ever confronting the beast, Eleanor's curiosity burned like a fire, unquenchable. And unlike David, she didn't believe in merely witnessing the horror. She wanted to confront it, to understand the darkness that had taken so many lives. Eleanor had heard rumors of David's arrival in the village, and the whispers had only deepened her resolve. She knew he had gone into the miasma house, but no one had seen him leave. In her gut, she felt that something had gone terribly wrong. So, with the storm swirling above her, she prepared to face the monster herself. As she approached the house, she couldn't help but feel a chill crawl up her spine. The closer she got, the thicker the air seemed to grow. It pressed down on her, as though the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. Her breath came in short bursts, her mind filled with fear, yet she pushed forward. She was determined not to be another victim of this cursed place. When she reached the front door, she hesitated. It creaked open of its own accord, the darkness inside more oppressive than any storm could be. She stepped inside, taking in the familiar, dreadful smell of rot and decay. The air was thick, the pungent stench of the creature's acidic presence suffocating, but she forced herself to breathe through it, to ignore the gnawing fear. The walls of the house groaned with age, their surfaces scarred with dark, greenish stains. The floor was slick with the acid, the air heavy with its burn. Eleanor's heart pounded as she made her way deeper into the house, every step feeling like an eternity. She had no idea what she would find, but she knew that to turn back would mean certain death, just as it had for David. Then, she heard it, the faintest of sounds. The hiss of acid, followed by the low growl of something unnatural. The creature was close. Eleanor's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the green monster. It had to be here, lurking just beyond her line of sight. She could feel the presence of it, like an oppressive weight pressing against her chest. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it, glowing green eyes, piercing through the darkness. The monster was watching her, her breath caught in her throat as it stepped forward, its massive frame emerging from the shadows. The creature's claws scraped against the floor, and the acid dripped from its form, sizzling as it hit the ground. Eleanor's pulse raced, but she stood her ground, refusing to run. She had come too far, and there was no turning back now. The monster hissed again, a sound that reverberated through the house, as though the very walls themselves were alive with its presence. It took another slow step forward, its gaze never leaving her. Eleanor's hand gripped the sharp shard of glass she had brought, but she knew it would do nothing against the beast. "Come then," Eleanor said, her voice shaky but defiant. "If you're going to kill me, then do it." The monster paused, its glowing eyes narrowing as it seemed to consider her words. Then, without warning, it lunged. The force of the attack was incredible, faster than Eleanor could react, and in an instant, it had her pinned against the wall. The acid began to drip from its body, sizzling as it splashed against her skin, burning her clothes and the flesh beneath. Eleanor screamed in pain, but the monster didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, enjoying her torment. The acid from its body began to melt through her clothing, the pain blinding, unbearable. She struggled, her hands trembling as she tried to push against the creature, but it was like pushing against a wall of iron. Its grip tightened, and she felt the life being slowly drained from her, the acid working its way through her body. As the last of her strength left her, Eleanor's mind began to slip into darkness. But before the blackness fully took hold, she realized something that sent a shiver through her soul. The creature didn't just kill its victims, it made them part of the house itself. It fed off of fear, and when it had drained them of all that they were, it consumed their essence, adding it to their house's malevolent presence. The last thing Eleanor saw before she was consumed was the monster's cruel, twisted grin, and then, the house was silent again, as it waited for its next victim.